Hey, welcome to ZAYTiME. I'm going to talk about how I do my drums and my drum processing. Here's an example. Alright, starting off with the snare, I basically start with 4 layers. I'll solo them out one by one. I'm also going to take off all the processing on them. I tried to use free plugins so that everybody had access to them. So everything I use is either free or built into Ableton. Minus that K clipper, I'll just delete that. Alright, so the snare on its own. So I have 4 layers going on here. One is this little click, which if I show you on this spectrogram, it's kind of just a vertical zag down with the sine wave. I used operator in a pinch envelope. Pretty straightforward. That becomes key in the sound of these drums later on. I would say the loudest portion is this layer, which is a filtered out sample from Wicked Drum Hits. I use a little pitch envelope to give it more of a knock at the beginning. Here's without that pitch envelope. It just shapes it up a little differently. On top of that, I've got this layer, which is just a... kind of sounds like noise, but it's kind of EQ'd and shaped to be like a clap. And then I've got this higher frequency noise to kind of be the air of my snare. So one at a time, all 4 of these. And it kind of rounds out to a snare sound I like. When I make a drum, whether it's a snare or a kick, I'm always keeping in mind the timing of each layer. In this snare, it's basically a 4-part thing going on. Well, some of them actually overlap, but I start with this snare crack, which takes priority. It's the first instant whatever hits. Second that comes in would probably be this little low end layer. It comes in immediately after, but you can see down here that I've got a little bit of a 25 millisecond delay. And next up I've got this layer, which if we look at that, it looks like it's coming in immediately, but must have sounded good the way I put it in there. I actually like that better. So the more you space the beginning out, the more clarity you'll get in your transient, whatever you choose for that to be. The last layer, I've got a little bit more of a delay to kind of have a slap back effect with the noise. Now these kind of delays on each layer really helps with the impact of the sound of the snare. It almost sounds like the beginning of the snare is knocking away the rest of the sound. To illustrate the timing of these layers a little better, the click is the first thing that hits. It's almost instantaneous. I'll put like a little time at the beginning. So this is about 1 to 5 milliseconds. I try not to go a little beyond that because this is the initial snap right where the drumstick would hit the snare itself. Immediately after that, I have the next layer going on, which is about 5 to 15 milliseconds. And this part can be variable. You don't have to have it exactly these numbers. Also, this area right here, there can be overlap, and sometimes it sounds better when you have a little bit of overlap between the next part. Now, the next part I'll make a different color too, so it's a little better illustrated. Next part being the tone, the fundamental tone of the snare. Now, this is where you're going to get a lot of the tuning of your snare. That's a key part, and the shape of this, the angle you're using, extremely important. Next step in the progression of this timing would be the noise layers. Now in this area, for me it's kind of free range. I'm not as particular about it. Now the way these fade in, I'm kind of particular about. I don't necessarily want them to hit at the beginning. So they'll kind of have like a attack in, that way there's a nice crossfade going on here. And so that would be around anywhere between 20 milliseconds on to, you know, 1 second, depending on how long the tail is. So this kind of spacing is crucial when you're getting a snare designed. If you just slapped everything at the beginning here, you would just have a mess of all different sounds, and you wouldn't have that clarity in the snap of the drum. Now, processing wise on this snare, I use pretty commonly a transient shaper. I just found this one for free. It's called Dominion. Just Google it. You can look it up. I'll link it in the description. Yeah, this one's pretty nice sounding. But there's plenty of different choices. With it on, you can hear a little extra snap in the beginning. With it. Then I have that feeding into a compressor to kind of shape off the noise. Generally, what I'm going for here is, if I get my little pen, I got the shape of the snare right here. I'm focusing just on this region, right in the first few milliseconds, and I'm really trying to make that part kind of poke out with the rest of the snare. Now, when I'm using these kind of transient shapers, I never really go by a specific number. I just use my ears and feel it out. I know the kind of snap I want. It's very hard to explain, so just trust yourself and what you like the sound of. Use references for examples. That is all going into probably my whole drum layer. It's processing, which is really not that much. I have this free analog style EQ, which I just give a little bit of low end boost, a little tiny bit of high end boost, and it's got this drive knob in it to kind of saturate it up a tiny bit. Without it, with it. So very, very subtle. Apart from that, I found a free 1176 style compressor called Thrill Seeker, made by the same guy who makes this boot EQ. Now this, in parallel with this audio effects rack, gives me a lot of control over the weight of these drums. Now without it, the snare seems to decay down, and it's kind of got this shape going on where the snare kind of decays naturally. But with it on, if I can switch back to it, with it on, I've got kind of a heavier decay side. So I still have the snap I like at the beginning because it's in parallel, but this region right here, I'm really getting the weight of all the reverb and natural decay all these samples have. So that's a key part in the bigness of these drums that I like. That's pretty much it for the snare. Another little trick I like to do sometimes is have separate layers, kind of enhance the snare here and there. So I have these other claps on here, which are pre-delayed, which is a great little feature here on the right. Most people don't understand that in Ableton you can click this little guy down here. It says I/O, and you get these little pre-delays. Now this is shifting the entire track by negative 35 milliseconds on this one, negative 24 on this one, and I also am layering in this layer of analog to give it a little extra pre-delayed noise. Now I'm going to record that back down to samples so you can see what's going on. So this little tiny bit going on here, this is an idea of what this analog layer is doing. It's a kind of a pre-delayed noise. I'll just solo it by itself. That's it. Just a little scoot before the snare. This, to me, if I'm thinking of actually hitting a drum, it's like the sound of the stick flying at the snare beforehand. I always try to visualize what a snare would actually sound like if it were in real life, and I try to replicate that in the digital domain. The only other thing I could say over the tonality of the snare itself, you can kind of experiment with reverbs in really low amounts. This Epic Verb is great free reverb. So with that, you get kind of more of a roomier sound. Without it, it's a lot cleaner, in your face. So with that, without that. And Obviously, you can change the decay times on this to give yourself, you know, creative freedom on what your snare sound is going to be in the end. Just keep in mind that your snare is actually going to be feeding through those compressors, so the littlest bit of reverb is actually going to be magnified by that compression. So a lot different, just with a little bit of reverb on one point in the chain. Next up is my kick. Now with the kick, I really don't have much going on. I just used a sample. The sample on its own, without the processing, is like this. Let me take off the filter. So that's it, just a sample. I'll take the pitch envelope off as well. So the sample on its own, it sounds completely different from my end result. I put the filter on first to take a little of that high end out. Then I put this EQ on next to make it a little deeper sounding. Using the pitch envelope, I got more of a knock at the beginning. So that right there was key in shaping the sound of this kick. Next up, I put a tiny bit of this transient shaper on there. Actually, it seems to barely do anything. Just a little extra click in the beginning. And then a limiter kind of to make sure I wasn't peaking over a certain amount, which isn't even being touched, so probably just to bring it up to level. A few other layers in the kick I have going on. It's just a hi-hat, that's it, with its own kind of EQ. I took out a nasty frequency I didn't like. Very important here with the hi-hat layer, I messed with the ADSR and took a little bit off the attack. Otherwise I'd be hitting at the same time as the kick's transient and interfering with the clarity of that punch at the beginning. So that just gives it a little more texture, kind of like the sound a kick would make in real life if you're, you know, shaking things in your room because you hit the kick so hard. So with that, without it, just to give it a little extra air. The last layer is a little thump I put on. I used a synth. You could do this with built-in synth. I know at the beginning I said you don't need anything external, which you don't. You could do this with operator. I'm just not going to waste your time and do that. But literally just a little knock sound. And it barely adds anything to it. It's just, I need a little more punch in the low end. When I'm making kicks, any kind of drums, I always like to use a spectrum analyzer. One that actually shows frequencies over time, just so that I can look at the shape of the kick. I've been looking at these for a long time, so I've studied different tracks, how I like the sound of them, what to look out for. That's going to come down to your personal preference, because all drums and tracks are different. But to have a tighter drum kit, generally you don't want a lot of this boot action going on. That being the, if I kind of draw this out a little bit, that being the shape of a drum being like this, where I'm kind of getting these, let me draw that better. I'm getting these kind of lines like this, but I'm not having the frequencies go out like this. And once you get that kind of a thing, then you're kind of looking at a situation where the kick becomes the bass line as well. So I try to avoid that as much as possible. As far as that goes, the only other thing creating the punch of these drums would be the side chaining. I'm running basically every synth in this track to this layer, or this bus, which I call side chain. Running 2 instances of LFO tool. You could use the compressor built into Ableton to do side chaining just as much. I just prefer this due to the extra control you get. As apart from that, oh damn, starting up Dark Souls. Alright, apart from that, without this, it's not going to make too big of a difference. Take these out real quick. It ducks the track, but the clarity of the transients in these drums really helps them to stand out in the mix. And that's how I make drums. I'll go more into detail if you guys ask for it.